watching Fugitive Red-Eye, and Bates Motel has finally ended this week, so I thought I'd go ahead and give a review of the series versus the Psycho films, and to a lesser extent the Psycho novels. Be warned that this will contain spoilers for all four Psycho films, possibly all five seasons of Bates Motel, as well as the shitty 1987 made-for-TV Bates Motel movie. So I watched through all of Bates Motel, and I loved it for the most part. But around season 4, I felt the series had declined slightly because not a lot of things happened. Most of the season was just Norman in the institution, and then Norma dies in a very different way than she did in the original movies and the novel. Season 4 is for the most part boring. However, Season 5 I was skeptical from the get-go because they'd cast Rihanna as Marion Crane. You know what else Rihanna was in? Battleship, and that movie was fucking awful. However, surprisingly, because I had such low expectations for Rihanna's performance, she actually surpassed them. I still feel she was miscast as Marion Crane, but I think she did a fine job given what I've seen her do previously. What I didn't like and what caught me off guard was how they changed several things in the 5th season. The first thing that really pissed me off is Norman gets fucked by some guy in a bar when he's in his Norma personality. First off, the Norma personality was never supposed to be overtly sexual, only jealous and only having eyes for Norman. That's how it was in the books, that's how it was in the movie, and that's how it was in the earlier seasons for the most part. Another thing, Norman became aware of the Norma personality and realized that she wasn't really there. That takes away a lot of the impact of Norman being crazy, because the whole point of Psycho is Norman thinking his mother is still alive by creating this fictionalized version of what's actually happening in his head. Also, they changed the shower scene, probably the most iconic scene in horror film history, I think. And they had a twist where she gets out of the shower and she survives, but instead Norman kills Sam Loomis. And I think they really turned Sam Loomis into a generic character in the series. They really fucked him up, because although he wasn't absolutely amazing in the movies, and he wasn't the main character, I feel like this Sam Loomis in Bates Motel is much more generic. It's just, oh look, there's the asshole taking advantage of the two women he's with, and neither of them are aware of the fact that each other exist. Okay, first off, in the movies, Sam Loomis was cheating on his wife with Marion Crane, but she knew about it, and they were both at least showed some guilt for it. In Bates Motel, Marion's unaware of it, and Sam acts like a total asshole. Basically, they just want to make him out to be, oh look at this asshole taking advantage of these poor innocent women. And in that regard, it makes Marion less of an interesting character. Because of Marion's flaws in the original film, you actually get attached to her, and when Norman kills her in the iconic shower scene, you actually feel sad about it. Also, another thing, in Season 4, they also had Norman's Norma personality hitting on his psychologist, which I thought was also pretty fucking stupid. Not to mention that the more I think about it, I've always preferred the movie Norma over the TV show Norma, because she was just such a total bitch that it actually made sense that Norman went crazy. Although, according to Psycho 4, it was all genetics, but honestly, it was obviously environment, especially with the shit you see him go through in Psycho 4. One thing I will say about this series, though, is Freddie Highmore is still the perfect modern-day Norman Bates. And the way he interacted with Marion were just like the ways that Anthony Perkins interacted with Marion in the original Psycho film. And then, of course, there's the ending to Bates Motel. Dylan kills Norman because Norman tries to kill him and won't accept reality. And while I kind of saw this coming, I was still disappointed with it. Not because I'm against a tragic ending, in fact I've always felt that at its core the Psycho series is a tragedy, but because I don't agree with killing him off just like that. In fact, this is where the shitty Bates Motel made-for-TV movie from 1987 did better. Because, unlike the novels, Bates Motel and Psycho both had Norman as a sympathetic character, particularly starting with Psycho 2, but regardless. The 1987 Bates Motel film was originally made to be a pilot to a series called Bates Motel. It has no relation to the second Psycho film, or no relation to the Bates Motel TV series that exists now. Instead, in this version, Norman dies in the asylum. However, he befriends a young man in there, and decides to give his motel to him. Realizing his life is effectively over, he decides to pass on his legacy to someone whose life is not completely ruined, and hope to give them a future. This, to me, was the perfect way for Norman Bates to die. In fact, the intro to the Bates Motel film actually isn't half bad. For a few minutes, but as soon as he walks inside the Bates Motel and there's that chick in the chicken costume, he goes way downhill. Now, it's worth mentioning that I do believe Norman dies in the Psycho 2 novel, because the Psycho 3 novel is about him haunting the Psycho house. Plus, Norman is considerably different in the novels than he is in the movies or TV shows. First off, in the novels, Norman is a fat, balding guy in his mid-40s who's an alcoholic that worships Satan. I shit you not, that's actually backstory to Norman Bates in the first novel. Now, I haven't read the second or third novels because, frankly, I wasn't that interested, because I prefer Norman as a sympathetic character rather than as an antagonist. And it was Psycho 2 that first cemented this, and in many ways helped form what the franchise would become for the next two films, and even to a lesser extent the Bates Motel TV series. Psycho 2 does a great job of tricking you most of the film. For instance, it's Norman living in the motel, people being killed, and everyone assuming Norman's doing it. In the final scene, it catches you by surprise that it was in fact Lila Loomis doing the killings to try and frame up Norman. Or so it would appear. However, at the end, there's a second twist. Norman's aunt, Emma Spool, who at the end of Psycho 2 claims to be his mother, although it's revealed in Psycho 3 she was just his crazy aunt, she was going around doing the killings, and everyone thought, or the audience, rather, was tricked to believing it was Lila Loomis up until the final scene. And then, of course, all this trauma, unfortunately, triggers Norman to revert back to his psychotic tendencies. Which leads to Psycho 3, where he's going around killing people once again, and ends up returning to the asylum. This all leads up to what I feel is the best conclusion the Psycho series has had. Psycho 4, The Beginning. This acts both as a prequel and a sequel at the same time. It's Norman Bates calling into a radio show, apparently years after Psycho 3, with his wife, who is pregnant, and he's calling because he's thinking about killing her, because he's worried his psycho genes will be passed down to the child and cause more craziness. He also recounts the story of how he killed his mother, and you see it happen, which is great, because this was the first time you see Norma die. Other than a little bit of a flashback scene in Psycho 2, which doesn't really show it, but kind of does. It's kind of hard to explain if you haven't seen it. Now, obviously, there are some inconsistencies between Psycho 2 and Psycho 4, namely Norman claimed to be 12 when he killed his mother in Psycho 2, whereas he's obviously in his late teens in Psycho 4. But the reason Psycho 4, I feel, is the best finale the Psycho series has had is the ending. The ending to Psycho 4 is what makes it my favorite of the sequels. It obviously does not beat out the original, but it is better than the sequels. At the end of Psycho 4, Norman torches his mother's house, resisting the urge to kill his pregnant wife, and ending up being free of the curse that she put on him, basically. He's free of her influence. And it ends on a happy note, with Norman going, living with his wife, and presumably raising their child to be happy. I don't know how the novels end, but I do know how the Bates Motel movie is, from 1987, as I previously mentioned, and it's about a bunch of ghosts and shit haunting the motel after Norman's gone. Not even Norman's ghost, not ghosts of his victims, just random-ass ghosts that make no goddamn sense. And then the Bates Motel show ends with Dylan killing him. And while I don't think this is a terrible ending, because I kind of like it to some degree, because I'm a fan of, like, for instance, of Mice and Men, I don't think this is the way I want Norman Bates to go out. So, in that regard, I feel that the Norman Bates, portrayed by Anthony Perkins in the 4 Psycho films, is the true Norman Bates. The novel version of Norman Bates kind of sucks. The TV version is just barely off being better. The character development of Norman Bates in Bates Motel is still really good. The TV series, of course, not the shitty movie, as I previously mentioned. And while I am okay with the ending, because I do, like I said, feel Psycho is at its core a tragedy, I feel like Psycho 4 is still a much, much better ending to Bates Motel. And if you haven't seen it, and you still managed to watch through all this video, even though everything's spoiled now pretty much, I still advise you go check out Psycho 4 to see how Norman Bates truly went crazy, rather than just seeing the bullshit that happens. Like, Bates Motel, they go a lot more on the genetic stuff, I think. Although no one else is really crazy. I mean, Norma's a little bit possessive, but that's about it. She's not the bitch who dresses him up as a girl and threatens to cut off his penis, like in Psycho 4. At least I'm pretty sure she threatens to do that. Because stuff happens, and I don't want to spoil everything or get too much into it, but she does dress him up like a girl and tells him he's a girl and drives him nuts. It's obviously she drove him to the madness. But anyway, that's all I really have to say on the matter. Psycho, the films, is by far the best version, followed closely second by Bates Motel, even though I don't particularly like Season 4 and 5. Also, another quick note, though. Season 5 didn't have Lila Loomis, it didn't have Arbogast, and it didn't have a lot of characters that would have made it more like the movies. I feel like something that would have helped was to have callbacks to those original characters, other than just Sam Loomis and Marion Crane. But anyway, that's really all I have to say. I hope you guys have enjoyed this little talk that I've had here. I don't know if you'd call it a rant or a review. Do with it as you will, but have a great rest of the day.
Subscribe to Fiji Red Eye.